What would you get if you asked someone passionate about Tolkien, D&D, and monster porn to write a series of light novels? Well, probably the series I'll be reviewing today. It's really dark and gruesome at some points, light and fluffy at others, and altogether weird, but in a good way. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present Goblin Slayer. Think of Goblin Slayer as a D&D session where the GM got a bit too drunk. First, he decided that having multiple monster types was a pain, so all the quests would be against goblins. Then, he decided that allowing players to name their characters was a pain, so all the characters would be referred to only by their roles, such as Dwarf Shaman, Lizard Priest, and Cowgirl. Yeah, seriously, there's a character in this series referred to as Cowgirl. Finally, he decided to make things as meta as possible. So you have people in the world talking about the gods rolling dice, characters getting critical hits, and the good and bad races in the world are called praying characters, PCs, and non-praying characters, NPCs respectively. Now, what is the story the drunk DM came up with? Well, in broad strokes, some fantasy kingdom has a problem with goblins. They plunder villages, kill the men, and rape the women. The kingdom's army and the heroes are far too busy dealing with important things like fighting demon lords and preventing the world's destruction, thus it falls on our protagonist, the Goblin Slayer, and his fantasy trope companions to save the villages while other people save the world. I guess I forgot to mention this before, but Goblin Slayer is a harem series, with a number of beautiful girls all pining over our protagonist. True to classic harem protagonist form, Goblin Slayer is oblivious to their attention, but at least he is somewhat deserving of it. Goblin Slayer's whole village, including his beloved sister, was wiped out by goblins when he was young, and, as his name would suggest, he has devoted his whole life to slaying goblins to get his revenge. While he does have a very one-track mind, he is also kind and conscientious, and hence his harem grows. It consists of Cowgirl, Guild Girl, Priestess, and High Elf Archer, who I would give descriptions to, but really you can just think of the common archetypes for each of those descriptions, and you'll know exactly who they are. Oh yeah, there's also a couple of other male characters, with a Dwarf Shaman, who is the dwarfiest dwarf who ever dwarfed, and a Lizard Priest, the only non-tropey character, if only because I don't know if there is a well-defined archetype for lizardmen. Despite the character personalities all being taken from Fantasy Tropes 101, they're all well enough written to be likable, and while you may roll your eyes as the elf and the dwarf bicker, because of course they do, it's still pretty entertaining. So, the premise of Goblin Slayer, a high fantasy where the only enemies are goblins, is cool and all, but what really makes it tick is the setup and execution of that premise. First, for the setup. So in this world, goblins pose an interesting problem. Individually, they're pathetically weak, so there's no glory in slaying them, and they tend to attack rural villages which are far too poor to pay a proper reward for slaying them. That being said, they tend to gather in high enough numbers and are cunning enough to easily wipe the lower level adventurers that would actually consider taking the quests to defeat them. So, to summarize, high level adventurers can't be arsed to take care of goblins, and low level ones just die. This then, A, gives importance to the Goblin Slayer's actions and hence the interest in the story, and B, forms a pointed critique of most fantasy stories, which tend to focus on the glorious heroes doing heroic things over other people protecting the common folk in less flashy ways. Now, as for the execution, the way Goblin Slayer dispatches foes is a pleasure to watch. From diverting a river into a goblin's nest, to poison gas, to jury-rigged traps, he often has creative ways to deal with his foes. And even in martial combat, he tends to use whatever comes closest to hand, continually improvising. As I was reading this, I was always wondering how he'd deal with the next obstacle he faced, and excited to see what he came up with. Now, for a complete non sequitur, another thing I enjoyed about the series is all the Tolkien references. From a recreation of the riddle scene with Gollum and Bilbo, to a chapter titled There and Back Again, if you've read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, you'll find a couple little things here and there you'll get a kick out of. Goblin Slayer can be a bit disturbing at times. The goblins of this world use women of other races as breeding stock. and are also quite into torture. So yeah, I rather suspect that aspect of the story will turn some readers off. Other than that, well, how tolerant are you of harem romances with dense protagonists? Because Goblin Slayer is about as dense as they come when it comes to women. One of the heroines could literally walk into his room at night, strip naked, and he still wouldn't get the message. Admittedly, the main focus of this series isn't romance, but whenever it rises to prominence, it kind of feels like the heroines are all beating their heads against a wall. A really hard, reinforced concrete wall. Goblin Slayer is in a crowded market with lots of other fantasy world with RPG mechanic light novels out there, but it stands apart. A, because of its original premise, and B, because unlike most others, it's not an isekai. Some of the darker aspects of Goblin Slayer will undoubtedly turn some people off, but if that's not an issue for you, I highly recommend it. If you've already read Goblin Slayer and are looking for something similar, I would recommend Grimgar: A Fantasy in Ash, which has both a similar setting and some similarly dark moments. Alternately, you could also try Rako no Yusha if you're really into Goblin Slayer's innovative fighting style and want to see more of that. Anyways, that concludes my review. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for listening. Cheers!